Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Marcia Eli, and I have the honor of welcoming you all on behalf of everyone here at the Center for Brooklyn History, as well as my colleagues at the Brooklyn Public Library and BPL Presents, which is the arts and culture arm of the library. So tonight, we bring together three people who have much to say about the role of apology, memorialization, and repair in addressing the legacies of transatlantic slavery. This is the third program at CBH relating to reparations for slavery. The first focused on what is currently happening in New York City after our council passed the groundbreaking bills that acknowledge and address New York City's deep history of slavery. The second moved to New York State to reflect on the work of the Reparations Commission appointed by Governor Hochul. And tonight we move to a global conversation about reparatory justice by looking at one example, the case of apology and reparative justice on the island country of Grenada. At a time when diversity, equity, and inclusion is being dismantled in our country, and a new executive order claims to, quote, restore truth and sanity to American history, it's more critical than ever that we continue the conversation about the deep, unresolved wounds of the institution of slavery. I want to say that I have struggled mightily to find a brief way to tell you about the three exceptional speakers who will come to the stage in just a moment. Their accomplishments are remarkable and hard to summarize, but in the interest of hearing from them and not about them, I will be painfully brief. As you'll see, each brings a unique voice and perspective to this discussion. Laura Trevelyan is the British-American journalist whose 30-year BBC career saw her reporting from all over the UK and the world. She is also a leading advocate for the Caribbean's reparatory justice agenda. Laura will tell you her story herself. I'll simply say and add that she is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Chancellor of Cardiff University, and the author of two books, A Very British Family, The Trevelyan's and Their World, and The Winchester, An American Dynasty. She is also more recently co-founder of Heirs of Slavery, a group of British people whose ancestors profited from the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean. Arley Gill is the chair of the Grenada National Reparations Committee and a member of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. CARICOM, for those unfamiliar, stands for the Caribbean Community and Common Market, the group of 20 developing countries in the Caribbean that work together to shape policies for the region. From 2019 to 2022, Mr. Gill served as Grenada's ambassador to CARICOM. An attorney for more than 25 years, he has served in the Grenada Parliament, was the minister responsible for culture, information, and information communication technology, and also served as a magistrate in the Commonwealth of Dominica. Mr. Gill has dedicated his life to the cause of reparations and reparatory justice for Indigenous people, Africans, and African descendants. And he speaks regularly to local, regional, and international audiences on the issues of slavery, slave trade and the law, colonization, and reparations. And finally, Anthony Bogues is a professor of humanities and Africana studies at Brown University, as well as a professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Brown University. He is a visiting professor of African and African diaspora thought at the Free University of Amsterdam, a distinguished visiting professor and curator at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, and the convener of the UNESCO project Mapping Global Anti-Black Racism. He has curated many major exhibitions in the Caribbean, South Africa, the United States, and Paris. Most recently, and key for this discussion, he is co-curator of the current exhibition at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, titled In Slavery's Wake, Making Black Freedom in the Modern World. Finally, Professor Bogues is the inaugural director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown, where he has received numerous awards for his scholarship and research. He's completing 2 visual documentaries titled Unfinished Conversations, which tell the stories of racial slavery, European colonialism, and their afterlives. So in a moment, I'll welcome these 3 distinguished guests to the stage. But first, I want to make sure that you know that in connection with Professor Bogues' appearance here, we have available at the CBH shop the truly beautiful, exquisite book, In Slavery's Wake, which is related to the exhibition here that's at the Smithsonian now that I mentioned. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Laura. At the end, we'll turn to you and your questions. Our usher will bring a mic to you at your seat. I ask that you please stand as you speak and keep your questions brief and do the best you can to resist long commentary. So, we are so grateful to the 3 of you for bringing your insights to all of us sitting here tonight. Please help me welcome Arley Gill, Anthony Bogues, and Laura Trevelyan to the stage.
Thank you so much, Marcia. It's lovely to see so many people here. I'm Laura Trevelyan. This is Arley Gill. This is Tony Bogues. And thank you to Marcia and the Center for Brooklyn History for this opportunity. And it's lovely to see so many of you here tonight. So as Marcia was saying, Tony has just curated this incredible exhibition. And this is the book, which at the Museum of African American History and Culture called In Slavery's Wake. So we'll use that as our jumping off point about really the long reach of the transatlantic slave trade. And then we'll move to Grenada and the story of Arley and I. And I should say just at the outset that I'm a descendant of enslavers in the British Caribbean, absentee enslavers in the Eastern Caribbean island of Grenada. So Tony, if I could just start with you. I went to see In Slavery's Wake, which, what a fabulous exhibition.
Thank you very much.
And what it did for me, as someone who grew up in Britain and has lived in America for the last 20 years, in Britain, we're just taught that Britain abolished slavery, not the enormous reach of the transatlantic slave trade, not the link to slavery in America, or the link to slavery in South America. Can you just give us a sense of the global reach of the transatlantic slave trade from the 16th century onwards?
One of the reasons, thank you very much, and good evening to all of you, so thank you for coming out. One of the reasons why we did this exhibition was precisely what you have just said. We felt that wherever you are from, so I'm from the Caribbean, Jamaica, or if you are from the United States, or you're from France, or you're from England, United Kingdom, that wherever you are from, that the question of slavery, the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism is seen as a national question. So that if it is America, it's just the Americans. If it's from the British, it's just the British. If the Caribbean, it's just the Caribbean space. Without recognizing that racial slavery was a global phenomenon, one. Secondly, that it was tied to the European colonial project. You do not have racial slavery without not having French colonialism, Dutch colonialism, British colonialism, Spanish colonialism, you name the colonial power, and racial slavery was part and parcel of the colonial project. Thirdly, that even if it was not part of the colonial project, it actually helped your country. Many of you would not know in this room about iron. Iron ore was central to the slave trade. It was central to shackles. It was central to the making of ships. Do you know which country made more money out of iron than every other country? Sweden, in the period. So that therefore what you have is a situation where this is a global phenomenon because of European colonialism, and that even those countries who were not involved directly benefited. And so the question of racial slavery and of colonialism as tied together really is something that we call is about the making of the modern world. That you can't think about the making of the modern world. You can't think about from 1492 onwards, that is the Columbian voyages, what we in Jamaica would say, how Columbus buck up on the Caribbean and buck up on other places. You can't think about that without not understanding that you're looking at a global phenomenon and a world phenomenon. And that's important, our important platform and what led to this exhibition and book.
So, Grenada in the Eastern Caribbean is part of transatlantic slavery, and Arley, as well as being chair of Grenada's National Reparations Committee, was a history teacher. So, Arley, perhaps you could just tell us, how did Grenada fit into the global picture that Tony's describing?
Thank you very much, Laura, and pleasant good evening to everyone, and thank you for coming out. It is extremely important, though, that as we speak about the history of the Caribbean and the history of Grenada, that we must first acknowledge that the history of Grenada and the Caribbean did not begin with European intervention. And at first, we must pay homage to the first settlers, the first inhabitants of the Caribbean, and in Grenada in particular, the Kalinago people that were exterminated by the Europeans, clearing the way and clearing the path for the commencement of the Atlantic slave trade. And in Grenada, between 1669 to 1808 or thereabouts, about 129,000 Africans were forcibly brought to Grenada via the Atlantic slave trade. And that is just British figures. Of course, Grenada was once colonized by the French, so that Africans were brought by the French during the Atlantic slave trade to Grenada. Also, between 1835 to 1865, 3,200 Africans were brought to Grenada as liberated Africans. I give you that figure so that you will appreciate that by 1838, there was only about 30,000 Africans in Grenada. So the Atlantic slave trade, what is also lost in our discussion about the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, is that there was a genocide of Africans during that period of slavery. The plantocracy have already worked out that it was cheaper to replace African bodies by importing them rather than to support the growth of African families. And then we speak about the sexploitation of the African women and so on, who suffered immeasurably during the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. So that when we speak about reparations, which we'll get into sooner rather than later, we in the Caribbean and Grenada, we speak about one, the genocide of the indentured, of the genocide of the indigenous peoples, the Atlantic slave trade, and I don't have to tell you that hundreds, if not thousands, of Africans on board these slave ships died, and that some were simply thrown overboard to save the cargo. You can research or Google what is referred to popularly as the Bong case, where the British Court of Appeal awarded compensation to a slave trader who voluntarily murdered African captives aboard their ship. So all of that is there. So when we speak of reparations, we speak of the genocide of the indigenous population in Grenada and the Caribbean, the Atlantic slave trade, and slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Arley, for that overview. So, Tony, this was all a long time ago now. Slavery was abolished in the British Caribbean and in the United States in the 19th century. And yet, as your exhibit makes so clear, the legacies are with us today. How would you best describe how the past defines the present?
I think that it's really important to understand what Atlantic slavery was and why it was so distinctive in human history. I want to acknowledge what my colleague has just said about the indigenous population. There was genocide in the Caribbean. There was attempted genocide in this country, attempted, because the indigenous people still live in the United States. But one of the things I think is important to understand is that slavery in the transatlantic slavery was a distinctive kind of slavery. Many societies, human societies all over the world, had slavery of whatever form. That is, people were captured in wars, people had debt, and so on. What was distinctive about the transatlantic slave trade was that it practiced a form of slavery based primarily on race. And so for the first time in human history, race became actually a mark of, not just of difference, but a mark of perpetual slavery. So that if you were black or African in the transatlantic slavery period, you were marked for what? You were marked to be a slave. Why is that important? That's important because one of the central things about the transatlantic slave trade was the creation of anti-black racism. And therefore, if you think about the world today and the various structures of inequity around the world, you will see that anti-black racism is central to those inequities. And therefore, one of the lasting legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, or what I like to call a system of racial slavery, one of the lasting legacies is how anti-black racism structures the lives of many people and structures the actual lives of many societies in the world today. That's the legacy. And so that if you think through it, whether it is housing, whether it's education, whether it's people in prison in this country, what is called a carceral state, whether it is a certain kind of quote-unquote lack of development, and I want to put that in quotation marks, in places in the Caribbean and so on, whether you think about what Walter Rodden talked about, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, whatever you want to think about, whatever social problem you want to think about, economic problem you want to think about, it roots goes back to the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. It is why I said that the making of the modern world is rooted in transatlantic slavery and of colonialism. And that's something that we need to think about. One more thing very quickly is that there's a very important African-American writer called James Baldwin, in which he says that history moves through our bodies. And there's a way in which the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism has shaped our consciousness, has shaped our bodies, has shaped who we think we are and what we think we are. And I think that when you think about the 21st century, what you are thinking about is how that history travels like what I like to call like a sedimented deposit, almost like underground, but becomes the foundation for the way the world is set up today.
Well, so from that incredible overview from Tony and Arley, we'll move to the very specific example of Grenada. And I'll tell you that my great-grandfather, George Macaulay Trevelyan, was one of the best-selling historians of the first half of the 20th century in Britain. And his English social history celebrates the abolition of slavery as being one of the founding achievements of 19th century liberal Britain. And he says that slavery was horrid, but that's about it. He just celebrates the achievement of abolition, which is a pretty common narrative in Britain until really very recently. So certainly I grew up having no idea that my family were enslavers in the British Caribbean, and neither did my father's generation know. And it took University College London, who put online in about 2016 a database showing all the compensation that was paid to Britain's slave owners at abolition, not to the enslaved, but to the enslavers, because that was the only way that the bill could get through Parliament. And so when that database was put online, it showed that amongst the thousands of other British slave owners who claimed compensation for the loss of what was termed their property, there were various members of the Trevelyan family claiming for the loss of their enslaved Africans on 8 different plantations across Grenada. So this led me to Arley Gill, the BBC agreed to let me go and make a documentary about the Caribbean's reparations movement using this personal history as a way in. And so I met Arley on a fort overlooking Grenada's picturesque capital, and I asked Arley what was my responsibility as a descendant of enslavers in the current day. What was it incumbent upon me and my family to do? And Arley had a very clear answer for me, which I'll ask him to share with all of you.
You should pay reparations. The Trevelyan family, the whole lot of you.
Exactly. And not only that, before that, what should we do?
Apologize.
Yeah. And Arley said, for good measure, so too should the Queen of England.
Certainly.
Which, this was news to me because I hadn't actually known that Britain's royal family was involved in the slave trade.
Oh, they reaped a pretty harvest, I tell you.
Yes, the Royal African Company actually sanctioned the transatlantic slave trade at its inception. But so when I met Arley, I asked him about the legacies of slavery in Grenada today, and I just wonder if you could share with us a little bit about that, Arley.
Certainly. But just to carry on from where Professor Bogues left off, when he spoke so much about anti-black racism, and you mentioned as well the compensation that was paid to your family for the property of black bodies, is extremely important as well that we do not overlook the fact that chattel slavery, where human beings, black human beings, were seen as property, a thing to be bought and sold, like a bottle of water, a book, or a bag. And that is the core of that anti-black racism, where black people are seen as being of some lesser being, some lesser person, some lesser thing than other races, in particular the white race. And as such, that is why it's extremely important when we speak of reparative justice. So persons like Laura, for instance, that apology which we speak of have three elements. One is a recognition that is a crime against humanity, that something wrong had happened. Secondly, that you're sincerely sorry for what transpired. And thirdly, that not over your dead body it should happen again. That all races, all creed, all class should fight tooth and nail wherever we see injustice and we see enslavement of any people going forward. That was extremely important. But as I also explained that one of the legacies of slave trade and slavery in the Caribbean is religion. We did not know, the inhabitants of the Caribbean did not know of Christianity until the Europeans came. And one of the basic tenets that the Europeans taught us was that if we were to get forgiveness for our sins, we first have to confess. So that, similarly, that apology which we seek as part of reparative justice is a confession by those who enslave black bodies to admit that they have sinned, and they too have fell short of the glory of God. So that is extremely important. So that an apology is important. It means that you admit that your ancestors would have done us wrong, we, the descendants of the enslaved, and that you are prepared to repair the harm that was caused by the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. And although I said to Laura that you need to compensate and need to repair, we do not expect families to pay for all the harm that was caused by the British and the French and the Dutch. We do not expect the institutions, like the Church of England, the Bank of England. The Church of England, that's the Anglican Church. The Bank of England, the Lloyds of London. So insurance companies, banks, and Professor Bogues spoke earlier with regards to Sweden making iron for the shackles and so on. So too you had German companies investing in the Atlantic slave trade. So all over Europe, even those countries that were not directly involved in the Atlantic slave trade, they in some way or the other invested. But to get back to the Grenada model that Laura Trevelyan spoke about, it was very important that when we spoke to the Trevelyan, they asked us what is it they can do for reparative justice. They asked us, they came, they had a discussion with us, which is extremely important. Unlike the Church of England, who themselves decided how much money they are going to make available for reparative justice, how they are going to manage these resources, which programs they are going to fund, which programs they are not going to fund. We do not consider that reparative justice. And let us be absolutely clear tonight that when we speak of reparative justice, we're not speaking about a grant. We're not speaking about aid. We're not asking cap in hand for any assistance. What we are asking for is to be paid what we are owed and what we are worth and what we are deserved, what our ancestors deserve. And when Laura came to us, we had a conversation with regards to how you can go about making repair to the benefits that your ancestors would have had. So that is the model. The model, first and foremost, is to have a discussion with us. The CRC is appointed by the heads of government of the Caribbean.
That's the CARICOM Reparations Commission.
Yeah, the CRC, CARICOM Reparations Commission, appointed by the heads of state. And we are responsible for advising Caribbean heads of government how we should go about reparative justice. So the first thing we ask is a conversation. Secondly, under what is referred to as the 10-point CARICOM plan, which we will briefly explain as we go along this afternoon, we identified education as the area where we thought the Trevelyan can make some contribution. So that Laura, from her own pockets, and she's very modest, made 100,000 pounds available to us in Grenada. And these monies today are used by the University of West Indies for scholarships for Grenadian students. Because you have to understand that one of the legacies of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery was a lack of education, opportunities for us in the Caribbean. And that is one area that we want to address seriously in Grenada. And the Trevelyan family made a significant contribution. We need a lot more, but we're on the right path.
Absolutely. Before we get to the story of how Arley invited our family to come to Grenada to apologize for the actions of our ancestors, I just want to ask Tony to tell us about the intellectual backdrop and the Caribbean intellectual giants whose work informed what's known as CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparations. CARICOM is the association of Caribbean governments, mostly from the formerly British Caribbean, but from Eric Williams, Sir Arthur Lewis, there's this, and Tony is part of this incredible Caribbean intellectual heritage, and Arley too. What was the work that led to that plan, Tony?
I think that to think about the Caribbean intellectual tradition is to think about, firstly, quite frankly, the enslaved persons who attempted to change Caribbean society. And I can't think about that Caribbean intellectual tradition without not thinking about Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines. In other words, I can't think about it without not thinking about Haiti, because Haiti, in my view, was the society in which the breach opened up. I keep on saying to people, particularly when I teach students, that we all are very concerned about Haiti today and so on, but you have to understand that without the Haitian Revolution of 1791 1794, that a lot of the question of abolition of slavery may happen much later. So I begin always by thinking about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint and Dessalines. And then, you can jump immediately. There are a host of people, who don't talk about, people like Antonio Fermin from Haiti, whose book in the 19th century, The Equality of the Races, was a direct response to Gobineau and a whole set of other Europeans who were talking about scientific racism. But if you come to the 20th century, you are thinking about, obviously, of Eric Williams. So it's capitalism and slavery. You're thinking about Sailor James's Black Jacobins. You're thinking about a female historian from Guyana whom we do not mention a lot. Her name is Elsa Govaya. And I want to mention Professor Govaya because it was she who argued, firstly, that to think about slavery in the Caribbean is to think about the black body, and these were her words, as property in person. And that, therefore, to think about how that black body becomes a certain kind of commodity. And that's how that's what she identified it as, and identified the black body as, and therefore went on to say how it actually becomes disposable, and is seen as a body of lack. That's Professor Govaya's work. Not many people talk about her. She's the first professor of West Indian history at the University of the West Indies, and was from Guyana. She was the professor who taught Walter Rodney. When I went to UA in the late 1970s, she was not around. She had died. But one heard about her and the history classes, West Indian history classes, that she had. So the entire Caribbean intellectual tradition, which in my view, against slavery, against anti-black racism, against colonialism, in my view, really opens up with full force in 1794 in the Haitian Revolution, and continues today, obviously, with the work that some folks like Hillary Beckles and others are doing in the reparations movement.
Thank you, Tony, for that. So Hillary Beckles, who Tony was just talking about there, is the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, author of the seminal book, Britain's Black Debt, chair of CARICOM's Reparations Commission, of which Arley is a member. And after I met Arley, and we talked during the BBC documentary, after that, members of my family in Britain got together, this is in 2022, and said, well, what should we do? Grenadians are saying that, yes, you can apologize for what your ancestors did, and yes, it would be meaningful, and yes, you can pay reparations. And so I invited Professor Beckles to join our family on a Zoom. So there are about 40 people, and he zoomed in from Barbados wearing his African tribal shirt, and he has a very commanding presence. And he sort of boomed across the Atlantic Ocean to my relatives, and he said, yes, you can and you should apologize, because our history in the Caribbean is like a void. You know who you are, you Trevelyans. You can trace yourselves back to the Doomsday Book. But we don't know. All we know is that our ancestors were kidnapped. So actually, you're part of our history, and if you come forward, it will be meaningful. And he said, you'll be welcomed in the Caribbean, he said. So in February of 2023, Arley Gill, on behalf of Grenada's National Reparations Committee, and his colleague, Professor Nicole Philip Dow, who's a historian and also works with him at the Reparations Committee, we were invited, members of the Trevelyan family, to Grenada to deliver a public apology on behalf of our ancestors for enslaving the ancestors of the people of Grenada. And Arley, perhaps you can just tell us about that day, which was not entirely straightforward.
It was not plain sailing at all. In fact, we had some protesters inside and outside of the building demanding that the Trevelyan family pay more money, and £100,000 is not sufficient. But just to say, though, that when we embarked upon the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which I told you was set up by the CARICOM heads in 2013, that initiative was really and truly for us to engage heads of government in Europe. And it was not so much geared towards engaging families and institutions. So that when the Trevelyan family came to Grenada, it was the first time that this era of reparative justice advocacy started with the family. And that has opened up many doors that we have seen. The Gladstone family has now gone to Jamaica and Guyana and so on and so forth. And other institutions would have come on board after the Trevelyan family would have made take a bold step to come to Grenada to offer this public apology. And the words of that apology had to be settled before it was read, which is extremely important. If you follow the reparative movement, you will appreciate that Prime Minister Mark Rutte of Holland gave an apology in 2019 and so on. But the people of the Netherlands pay no heed, they take no notice of it, and they continue to demand that a true apology be done. And that's extremely important. That is why I said, first and foremost, that we need both sides of the divide to sit around the table to have that discussion. So we settled on the words of the apology that was read out by the Trevelyan family, and everything that the Trevelyan family did had to be approved or discussed with us. So it was a team effort, basically. And by the time we settled in the room to have the apology read and so on, the Grenada Prime Minister, Honorable Deacon Mitchell, was there as well to accept the apology on behalf of the government and people of Grenada. By the time we settled in the hall, all of the protesters were quietly sitting in the room with us to witness the ceremony, because I went out, I engaged them and so on, because you see, a lot of the time, we have to engage persons who may have different views and different perspectives from us. We have to engage them. We had to explain to them that really and truly we do not expect one family to carry to pay for all the sins of the British Empire, right? And that the initiative by the Trevelyan family, what we said then in terms of opening up doors, certainly it has then transpired other families. We are in discussion as we speak with families who are living in Australia and New Zealand and so on, that they are willing to come forward in Grenada to make an apology and to offer reparative justice. We have discussions ongoing with other families, and we applaud these efforts. We hopefully that they not only come to Grenada, but the initiative of the Trevelyan family ultimately will put pressure on the British government, on the royal family, and so on and so forth. So they too will come forward. Laura Trevelyan, and so they are the small fishes in a big pond. We are hoping to catch the big fishes one day.
For sure. And I thank you, Arley, for saying that it was a team effort, because that was my feeling about it, and that was what, for us, was so beautiful and powerful, was to be actually welcomed. Not at all by all Grenadians, I would say. And a number of people in Grenada have said to me, well, what does your apology do for me? It doesn't change anything. £100,000 is no money at all. And it's nothing compared to the amount that your ancestors made. And it doesn't change the fact that here we are living in the hurricane belt in a country where money has been extracted for centuries. But at the same time, lots of people said to me, a burden that I didn't even know I was carrying has been lifted by your apology, and the acknowledgement of the wrongs is much more important than any amount of money, in fact. So, Tony, I just want to ask you, as someone who is a child of the Caribbean yet living here in the United States, what do you think of this model of apology and repair, and does it have any applications here in the US?
A couple of things. Firstly, I think that the business of apology is important because apology is about the recognition of a wrong done. That's the first thing. However, I want to take it from my colleague that many families are really small fishes. Not just small fishes, but that racial slavery and colonialism were state structures. They were organized by the colonial state. They were structured in law by the colonial state. They were structured in common law by the colonial state. It was the colonial state that was responsible for and made these things possible. Now, families and companies made a lot of money, but so did these colonial states. And therefore, for me, one of the things about apologies is that apologies without justice, to me, is problematic. And I tell you why it becomes problematic. It becomes problematic because apologies can then just be seen, okay, the matter is closed, I have apologized. I'm not saying this in your case, but I'm saying there is a real danger in focusing on apologies, which I think must be made. But that you have to then understand what's the link between apologies? What's the link between apologies and justice? What's the link between apologies, reconciliation, and justice? And I spend a lot of time in South Africa, and I'm always amazed by the ways in which the TRC, which I spent some time looking at, created a situation of reconciliation. But I'm also equally troubled that even though a reconciliation has happened and a civil war was averted in South Africa, all right, so this is immediate in our lifetime, if you want to put it that way, that the question of land and the question of employment and the question of education and so on for the vast majority of the black population remains outstanding and remains something that is a really important set of issues for South African societies. So I've come to the conclusion that I will fight for apologies. I will argue for apologies. But I also have to, and I welcome all persons and all families that say, yes, we did something wrong and we want to atone. Absolutely. But until we begin to think about the justice that is important and the structures, how to change the actual structures inside these particular countries, then I think that the apologies just will remain, quite frankly, and I hope I'm not being too harsh, will remain kind of words that people have. And people would say, yeah, that's great. Even people will even say a burden has been lifted from me. But even when that burden has been lifted from me, I have to find the money. And I'm speaking very much as a Caribbean person here. I have to find the money to send my children to school tomorrow morning, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that. And that the structural inequities that have to do with education are a legacy of racial slavery and a legacy of colonialism. It hit me again last week. I'm listening to BBC, and I'm listening to a Jamaican writer, and I'm listening to Diane Macaulay, and she's talking about a small village that was where there were free people after enslavement in the 19th, after the end of slavery. And she was talking about the places where the planters lived and how the planters actually, where they lived, had not just a great house, but had water and amenities. And where the people who were obviously the descendants of the enslaved only got water 2 weeks ago. Right? And it hit me that here is this village created after slavery, and with all these hundreds of people from the enslaved, thousands of people, and that water, a basic amenity of life, was not given to them until 2 weeks ago. So they were without water for over 150 years. Right? So that to me the question, therefore, is of apology is that it has to be linked to justice. We have to find ways, and we're intelligent. We human beings are intelligent. We have to find ways in which we can begin to think about how to link apologies to making life better for the descendants of those persons who were enslaved.
And I think that Arley and I have tried to think about that together for 2 years, because Hillary Beckles said to our family, if you come forward, you can be an example, and you can be an example to Britain's government. Because if a family can apologise for slavery and pay reparations, then why can't a government? And in that simple leverage is something that we've tried to use together in Britain's government. And one way into it has been climate change. Grenada's sister islands of CARICOM and Petit Martinique, as many of you may know, and also parts of Jamaica, were damaged incredibly badly by Hurricane Beryl last July. The Caribbean is in the hurricane belt, and P.J. Patterson, the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, who's now 90, longest-serving Prime Minister in the Caribbean, said to me once, Laura, the same winds that blew our ancestors from Africa now threaten us with ever stronger storms. So the argument that the former colonial powers should be helping the formerly enslaved colonies with climate resiliency is, to me, a powerful intellectual argument. And I don't know, Arley, do you think much headway is being made with Britain's government? There's a new government in Britain now. What do you think?
Well, first of all, it was heartening for us to, at the last Commonwealth Heads, to have the
Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in October.
Government meeting It was heartening for the subject, the topic of reparations, to be, for the very first time, to be added in the statement coming out of the Commonwealth Heads for the very first time. And of course, the King of England is the head of the Commonwealth, and the British government is the leading government. The headquarters of the Commonwealth is in London. Basically, the Commonwealth is a grouping of the former British colonies, basically. And for the very first time, only last year, that the subject of reparative justice was tabled at the Commonwealth heads. And that is because of the initiative of our Caribbean heads. Now, even this new Prime Minister
Of Britain.
He still continues to toe the same line as the former Prime Minister, and to say that Britain would not pay reparative justice and so on. But part of the thing is that I believe they're scared. The British government is scared. And I understand, too, that they have to speak to their constituents. To many people, when they hear about reparative justice and about justice as what Professor Bogue spoke about, they think that we in the Caribbean are going to be sailing up to London with container ships and fill them up with monies and sail back down to the Caribbean. In other words, they think we are going to bankrupt their economies. And that is why the CARICOM Reparations Commission, we have established what is called the 10-point plan, with apology being only the first one. But when Professor Bogue speaks of justice, we speak also of repair being justice. How are we going to repair the harm that was caused? With regards to health, the deficiency in our health sector in the Caribbean, the deficiency in our education sector, the large debt that is owed by Caribbean countries to all of the financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions. When Grenada and the rest of the Caribbean islands, including Jamaica, received their independence, the British did not leave $1 for them to pay public servants or to pay for infrastructure the very next day. And these brave prime ministers, as much as we think sometimes negative things about them, they had to find a way in which to sustain our independence and to sustain the livelihoods of Caribbean people, which now lead us into revolving debt. We can never finish pay the debt that is owed in the Caribbean. Then also, we speak about technology transfer in the 10-point CARICOM plan. America, what? You now enjoy what? AI? By the time 20 years you have AII, the Caribbean may just be having AI. I make the point to say that we will never catch up with the developed world unless and until reparative justice. That is, in our respectful view, the link that would create the standard of development in the Caribbean that would bring us maybe close to be on par with the developed world.
Could I just say something very quickly, that there is a very concrete thing about reparative justice that we need to think about, particularly those of us who live in the United States, Europe, and so on. Part of the Caribbean reality is something called a public debt. The Caribbean owes in many places, in many Caribbean countries, pay back the multilaterals of this world much more than we have borrowed. And we are being touted, particularly by the World Bank and others, as being great countries because we pay back these debt. Mm-hmm. To pay back these debt means health services are in trouble, means schools are in trouble, and so on. And therefore, one of the concrete things one has to think about is how does the so-called former colonial countries and former imperial countries then said, we will wipe this debt out, so that you then create a space for the actual countries themselves to begin to plan seriously to deal with the issues that they have to deal with.
Yeah, I would say that the way that the international financial institutions are structured, Caribbean countries count as middle income, which means that they have to pay higher rates of interest. But I want to just move the discussion onto the parallels between the United States and the Caribbean. And Tony, as Marsha said, this is a particular moment in American history with the Trump administration intent on tearing down what it calls the woke ideology of DEI. How do you assess the state of the reparations movement here in the US? And what are the parallels, if there are, to the Caribbean?
I think that the politics in the United States is at a certain inflection point. And that in that inflection point, what I like to call, following Stuart Hall, the Black British thinker, that there is an unfolding of a moment that is not conducive, and I'm using very careful language here, is not conducive to any cause that has to do with ordinary people and with questions of justice. That in that unfolding, whatever progress has been made in the reparations movement here, whatever progress has been made in this country, not just around DEI, but around the recognition of certain historical difficulties and the necessity for repair, to use that word, that all those things are going to be turned back. And that what is important, I think, is that we are going to have to, those of us who are citizens, those of us who live here, are going to have to think about what actions we need to take to actually stop the turning back. Because if there is no stopping, if the unfolding becomes consolidated, it is not just about waiting for another 3 years or for another 4 years, and then you can do something else, or for a midterm election. It is really about the ways in which this country is going to become something else. And that's how I see it. So for me, there are elements of the reparatory justice movement that, like keep on trying to keep it on, to use that kind of language. But there is a overarching difficulty which we have to recognize. And it is not just about United States, quite frankly. It's also going to be about the Caribbean and the world. Because the regime that exists here has made it clear, if one reads the Atlantic newspaper last week, that I am the ruler of the country and the world. And those are not my words.
Thank you for that overview, Tony. But I'll just try to go back to the micro from the macro. Arley, you spend a lot of time here in the United States. How do you see the differences between the Caribbean's reparations movement and what's unfolded here in America to date?
Allow me to endorse and to agree with what Professor Bogues have pointed out. I myself, it was very interesting listening to his analysis. I went to Chicago sometime in December, November to take part in a reparations conference there. That was right after the US elections. And although there was optimism among the participants, one could also sense that there was a little bit of the dampening of the spirit. Now, in the US, the reparations movement, there are different levels. There are the state levels, what the New York State, California State, what is done in Chicago and so on, and there's the federal level. And I believe that that challenge of state vis-a-vis federal gives another layer of struggle for the reparative justice movement here in the US. And I must admit that I'm fearful that the strides that were made over the last several years with regards to, different states in the US establishing reparative councils and advisory councils at the state level and so on, and to map out a pathway of how they can embark upon reparative justice. It will be interesting to see over the next year or so what will be the turnout? How would the philosophy and the policies of the federal government, how would that impact the state legislature going forward with regards to reparative justice? I think it will be interesting times here. The persons or the leaders involved in the reparative justice movement in the U.S., I believe they will have to be stronger, they will have to be smarter. And I also sense as well that America being such a powerful nation, and with the influence that one can have here in the U.S., I dread that it may also infiltrate or struggle with regards to the former European colonial powers. But it's a very interesting time that we have to.
It may also, though,
for.
be, as you can see, Europe is differentiating itself from the United States, having been told they're a bunch of sponges. And it may actually be that it's an opportunity for the European colonial powers to make common cause with the Caribbean, because the Americans won't like it.
That too.
that too. But I also say that this is not just here. It is politics that's all over Europe. I'm involved in a set of discussions in Netherlands about the building of a slave museum. And the way the turn of those discussions and the arguments that were there 4 years ago when that discussion was started and I was asked to join it are now different arguments today.
Wow.
So we have just a couple of minutes left before I open it up. And I wonder, Tony, if I could just ask you for your closing thoughts, and if you could also just reflect on, politically, it may be a difficult moment for the reparations movement in the United States, but do you think descendants of enslavers might have more of a role to play here in the US?
I don't know. I'm thinking hard about that question, and I'm thinking about, as I think about it, I think about speaking at a conference in Chicago, at the University of Chicago a couple of years ago, and on questions of slavery, and a woman church lady getting up and saying to me, I hear what you're saying and so on, but what I am doing is that myself and the people who enslaved me, we are meeting regularly to kind of work through what it is that we can do. And she was very strong about that, and I thought, that's important, all right? But not everybody will do that. So so that one case, which while I really was amazed, and she had a lot of things to say which I thought were important, and I wasn't sure was the full answer. My final thoughts on it is this: that we are in a moment in which the elements and the currents that shape the making of this modern world have come back on full display. That there are ways in which things are being said. I've lived in here country for 18 years. That 18 years ago, people would not say it. They would say it in there behind your back, but they would not say it publicly. And so that what strikes me is that we're in a moment in which it is almost like open season upon people of color. It's open season upon indigenous people. It's open season upon a whole host of other individuals. And that we are not sure, one is not sure what the outcome is. All I can say, therefore, in thinking about it is this, is that something my grandmother used to say to me growing up in rural Jamaica: all you have is freedom. You have nothing else. And that what you have to do, Tony, is treat people the way you want to be treated. But always know that your ancestors fought for freedom, which is the biggest thing in her language, which is the biggest thing to being a human being. And I just think that this question of freedom is being posed to us as human beings on this planet, from about climate change to all sorts of other things. And that is the issue that is on the table. But it is an issue that's been there because of how this country and the world was made. So the book that I hope that you will, if I can make a shameless plug, the book In Slavery's Wake.
Here it is.
Does not say just in slavery's wake, and is not just about a discussion of slavery. The book and the exhibition is titled In Slavery's Wake, The Making of Black Freedom. And that second part, the making of black freedom, the making of freedom for all of us on this planet, to me, is the task that faces us. That's how I think about it.
Thank you, Tony. And Arley, if I could just ask you very briefly, before we throw it open to questions, why does this discussion matter about reparative justice?
It matters, and if I may just lead on from where Tony left off, that freedom that he speaks of, while it is the core or the base on which we live as human beings, there must be development. There must be we must aspire as a people for a higher and better quality of life for generations to come. And an issue that we brushed during our discussions here this evening, the issue of climate justice. Climate justice is inextricably linked to reparative justice. The Atlantic slave trade and slavery was the fuel for the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The Industrial Revolution was the commencement or the beginning of the cause of global warming. We in the Caribbean, we in Grenada, we just had Hurricane Beryl. We had Hurricane Ivan. Every year, a major hurricane destroys one Caribbean island or the other. Despite the fact that we are not an industrial powerhouse, and maybe the biggest manufacturing sector in the region is probably still the production of a little rum. We do not have major factories and so on and so forth. But yet for all, we pay the price for global warming. So that the issue of climate justice, to my mind, goes hand in hand with reparative justice. And regardless of the regime that is in the US, regardless of the policies and the programs here, the struggle for us to continue to advocate for reparative justice can only be stronger. I believe if you say to us 4 or 5 years ago that we were having that discussion here at the Center of Brooklyn History and so on, people may laugh at us. I believe that we are making strides. I believe progress has been made, maybe not by leaps and bounds, but every step of the way, I believe we are making more and more progress, and we are making the issue of reparative justice a central topic of discussion globally, and that will continue.
Arley Gill and Tony Bogues, thank you so much. And we do have about 10 minutes for questions. And as Marsha said, if you could ask a question rather than make a statement, that would be great. And just say to whom you're directing your question as well. Sir, at the back. Can you send that? And yes, microphone is on its way to you now.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Happy Labor Day to everyone. I must say, if I were in Grenada, I'd probably be one of the people demonstrating against the Trevelyan's visit. Not that I'm an ingrate or anything, but I just felt that $100,000, I'm not going to make a long commentary, 100,000 pounds, $100,000 is really pittance. I know, for example, in my immediate family, my wife, myself, and I, we owe close to, we've been paying close to $100,000. I'm not asking for reparations. In fact, I think it's a bit problematic, the monetary, reparations. I am really in favor of more of a structural sort of like reparations and institution building. I know that Michelle Bachelet, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, she speaks of, the UN speaks of, a variety of different ways in which reparation can be meted out. And Mr. Gill spoke about, the whole issue of the environmental trust. I think that perhaps your best approach, and I'm wondering, it's a question, whether your approach would not be better if you had called for a meeting with the Grenadian masses. And so that, therefore, we can design, rather than you speaking to a couple of people, we can design a way to have reparative justice based on your family, the royal family, the British Bank, and the other institutions like the Church of England, whether you can actually encourage a coalition of these benefactors of slavery. And perhaps the better solution that will probably emerge from the people will be funding a state-of-the-art hospital, which is something that is really needed. Professor Beckles speaks about the health problem that the legacy of colonialism and slavery left, in terms of the proliferation of diabetes, hypertension, a variety of these kinds of diseases related to stress and poverty, right? So I'm wondering whether, you thought of this as a way forward. I'm wondering whether it's something that you may consider to revisit in terms of actually having a town hall with the Grenadian people in that way. And I'm also wondering, real quick, whether...
Yes.
Yes. I'm wondering whether you just discovered that your family was involved in enslavement. You wrote the definitive history of the Trevelyans.
Yes. Thank you so much for the question. I think maybe I'll sort of throw it open to Arley, because we did have a town hall, in a sense, didn't we?
Yes, but not only that, I will commend to the gentleman the 10-point CARICOM plan, which we have just reviewed. The 10-point CARICOM plan speaks to the mechanism or the structure of reparative justice for us in the region. So education is one, healthcare is one, and education, healthcare, technology transfer, debt forgiveness, repatriation for Rastafarians and so on who may wish to return to the motherland, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the 10-point CARICOM plan, you will appreciate that education is just one of it, and healthcare is another one. And we agree that £100,000 is not a lot of monies, but as I emphasized, that we do not expect one particular family to pay for the burdens of the entire British society. And as we have said, when we embarked upon this journey, we basically was looking at heads of state, and then families and institutions start coming along. And we here in Grenada, we have written to the Bank of England. The Bank of England owned 599 slaves in Grenada and 3 estates. We're still talking to them. They're not talking to us in good language, but we are still conversing with them. Maybe we'll use the Bank of England money to address the issue of healthcare. But it's an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing advocacy.
Ma'am, there's a question there, just from the lady on the right. Thanks.
Hi, how are you? My name is Magella Mark. I'm spearheading the rebuild of the CARICOM Museum in Grenada. And I just wanted to, ask a question in the sense of, Magella Mark, have been working on rebuilding this museum for almost a year now. and I am Grenadian. Just came from there 2 weeks ago. And I could name at least 8 to 9 different Grenadians who would love to return to Grenada and conduct projects. Now, I know everybody talk about, millennials and we're soft and what have you and full of shit and what have you, but I just have to say, we are trying to do things, but there's so much bureaucracy and so much red tape that it's getting very exhausting. Now, I have a meeting tomorrow at Zoom, a Zoom meeting, to finalize grant money to rebuild the CARICOM Museum, not the government, me. Now, I need to understand, what is your generation, the older generations, doing to give a smooth succession for the next generation so that this legacy of healing and prosperity and thriving is actually possible? Because I'm just saying, we can't, because I literally spoke to elders in Grenada that said, well, I just had to struggle and I had to start from scratch, so you have to do it too. We can't go from one generation after another coming up, having to go back to the starting line. It doesn't make any sense. Because you're gonna have people like myself who are not gonna return to Grenada because it's not gonna make any sense anymore. And I'm not trying to, throw shade. Okay, sorry, I'm very much Grenadian as much Flatbush. But I'm just saying, it comes to a point where younger people are gonna wanna
Arley,
leave.
this is a question for you from a young Grenadian. Right, what?
Well, I'm not certain if I have a brief from the Grenada government to answer this question, but I can say to you that the issue of the museum in Grenada and the issue of the public library, that has been a problem for the Grenadian government for the past, I would say, 25, 30 years. I spent a short time in government, and I tried my very best to see how we could address that issue, but that short time was not enough. But what I can do, though, is to have a conversation with you after the meeting, so maybe we can chat a bit further and see if we can unblock certain things.
All right, we've got time for one last question because we have to be out, ma'am, at the front. And then we've to finish at 7:50 on the nose.
I will do my best to keep this brief because I appreciate your time. My question is, I guess, on a more regional perspective, for many of us with Caribbean parents here who want to aid in the reparations movement, what can we do? Because I think for many of us, some of our parents say, when we were younger, we were doing this and we were doing that. But the reality is, for many of us, we want to go home, we want to help, but the government would rather prioritize Europeans getting citizenship because they're able to give $500,000, and they won't even give us a citizenship if we can't spell our name right. And I know because that's personally happened in my family. So with all that red tape, what can we do to help push this in the US, in Canada, in Europe, and beyond?
Tony and Arley.
I think that one of the things that we have to face up to is that some of the colonial bureaucracies, bureaucratic structures, still operate in our countries. I was in government with Michael Manley. And I know what is it that we tried to do, and I know how we were unraveled oftentimes by colonial bureaucratic struggles. A young lawyer friend of mine tells me from Jamaica, Marcus, that we have nearly 200 colonial laws still on the books. I don't know if the figure is right, that operate still in the bureaucracy. And this is the point I'm making, that a lot of times we in government, people in government, and since I was in government, I would say we get caught up in a lot of bureaucratic folderol than actually trying to think through, particularly with young people, what is the exciting things that they have to offer and that they can do. And so I think that there's a great talk regionally now about the diaspora. All right? Certainly in Jamaica, there's a big argument about whether or not diaspora can vote or should vote and so on. So I think that one of the things that needs to happen is that, and because I'm a Caribbean person, I'm not, I'm old-fashioned in that. I really still believe in a Caribbean, right? Not as an Anglophone, actually, but Hispanic and so on. But that one of the things that we might want to think about is how various diaspora portals that are being set up can begin to coordinate themselves to think through what major projects around reparatory justice that they would want to do. So that what are the Jamaican diaspora groups thinking about? What are the Grenadian diaspora? What's the Guyanese? What's the Trinidadian, etc.? And to begin to think about how you can actually begin to make demands around those things. There is never, the elders like myself, and I put myself in there, we have gray, because I have gray hair, tend to be kind of suspicious of those young people with energy. But the only way, one of the things that will save the Caribbean, besides all the reparatory justice and so on, is quite frankly you young people with energy. So that therefore you have to think through very carefully, how do I channel my energy? How do I coordinate and channel my energy to put pressure upon these governments that have a lot of talk about trying to win people back home and so on? Because, and I just end, because it must burn. It must burn when a government says, we will give citizens this extra, we have new citizen rules that allow people, and then you yourself think about, okay, why is it so difficult for me? All right? And so those are, I mean, that's my view.
Tony, thank you. Arley, I'm sorry, we're out of time. Thank you so much to our panelists and to you, the audience, for this evening, and Marsha and the Centre for Brooklyn History.